John Reynolds, the 48-year-old owner and CEO of SkyConnect Airlines, had always taken pride in his creation. From humble beginnings as a two-plane operation connecting small Midwest cities to major hubs, he had built SkyConnect into a respected, regional carrier with over 50 aircraft and routes spanning the country. The airline was his life's work, consuming his days and often his nights as well. Sitting in his corner office on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise, John stared at the quarterly report spread across his polished mahogany desk. The numbers looked good. Profits were up 4% from the previous year, and the efficiency measures he'd implemented had cut operational costs by nearly 7%. By all standard metrics, SkyConnect was thriving under his leadership, yet something felt off. John leaned back in his leather chair and gazed out at the city skyline. Despite the positive reports, customer complaint emails had been increasing. Nothing dramatic, but enough to create a nagging worry in the back of his mind. The airline's social media mentions had grown more negative too, though his young marketing team assured him this was normal industry chatter. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Reynolds, your 2 o'clock with the board members is ready in the conference room," his assistant's voice announced. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes," John replied, gathering his papers. As he organized his presentation, an article on his tablet caught his eye. It was about a hotel chain CEO who had gone undercover as a janitor in his own properties and discovered shocking truths about working conditions. The CEO had made sweeping changes afterward, turning the company around. The idea struck John like a bolt of lightning. When was the last time he had actually flown on one of his own planes? Not in the jump seat visiting the pilots, not in first class being recognized and catered to by staff who knew he signed their paychecks, but as a regular passenger in economy, experiencing what his customers experienced. He couldn't remember. 3 years? Maybe 4? Throughout the board meeting, as they discussed fuel hedging strategies and a potential new route to Denver, the idea continued to grow in John's mind. By the time the meeting ended, he had made his decision. That evening, instead of heading home, John called his wife. "I'll be home late tonight," he told her. "Something important came up." "Everything okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Yes, just need to look into something personally, don't wait up." At his desk, John pulled up the SkyConnect booking system and searched for flights. He wanted a long route, something that would give him plenty of time to observe. The Los Angeles to Boston route looked perfect, nearly 6 hours in the air. He booked a middle-of-the-week flight 2 weeks out, selecting an economy seat halfway down the plane. Instead of using his real name, he used his middle name and his mother's maiden name, Thomas Wilson. The next challenge was his appearance. As the face of SkyConnect, John appeared regularly in company communications and industry events. His clean-shaven look and neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper hair were recognizable to most employees. He would need a disguise, nothing dramatic, but enough to avoid immediate recognition. For the next 2 weeks, John grew out his beard, something he hadn't done since college. The result was a surprisingly thick, mostly gray facial covering that changed the shape of his face considerably. He purchased non-prescription glasses with large frames and began practicing a slight Midwestern accent, different from his natural East Coast cadence. The final touch was his wardrobe. John replaced his usual bespoke suits with off-the-rack khakis, a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and scuffed loafers, the uniform of the indistinct business traveler. Looking in the mirror the night before his flight, even his wife had to admit she might not recognize him at a quick glance. "You really think this is necessary?" she asked, adjusting his collar with a skeptical expression. "I need to see the truth," John replied. "Not what people show the boss, but what happens when they think nobody important is watching." On the day of the flight, John arrived at Los Angeles International Airport 2 hours early. He had arranged for a rideshare rather than his usual car service, and carried a battered leather briefcase and a small carry-on bag. Entering the terminal, he immediately noticed things a CEO normally wouldn't see. The SkyConnect check-in counters were understaffed, with lines moving painfully slowly. The self-check-in kiosks that he had proudly unveiled last year had out-of-order signs on 2 of them. The staff looked tired, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes as they processed passengers. John joined the line, fighting the urge to identify himself and ask what was going on. That wasn't why he was here. He needed to experience everything as a customer would. After 23 minutes in line, he timed it. John reached the counter. The agent, whose name tag identified her as Becky, barely looked up as she processed his boarding pass. "Window or aisle preference?" she asked flatly. "Aisle, please," John replied, noting how her uniform seemed slightly faded compared to the crisp appearance standards Sky Connect once maintained. "Gate B24. Boarding begins at 2:15, Becky said, handing him his boarding pass. No smile, no enjoy your flight. None of the little touches that had once been part of Sky Connect's service standards. Security was the usual ordeal, but at least that wasn't his airline's fault. On the other side, John made his way to Gate B24, observing the terminal as he walked. The Sky Connect gate areas, which had been renovated just 3 years ago, already looked worn. A water fountain was out of order, and the charging stations he'd approved as a passenger amenity were mostly occupied, with travelers sitting on the floor near the few available outlets. At the gate, John found a seat where he could observe the staff. The gate agent was dealing with a visibly upset passenger, something about a seating change. John couldn't hear the details, but he could see the agent's body language, defensive, slightly impatient. Behind the desk, a second agent was on her phone, seemingly oblivious to the growing line. Boarding began late, 17 minutes late by John's watch. No announcement was made about the delay. The premium passengers and those needing assistance were called first, then the boarding zones. John was in Zone 3. When his zone was called, John joined the shuffle of passengers moving down the jetway. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant gave a practiced welcome without making eye contact. Inside the cabin, John was immediately struck by how cramped it felt. Had the seats always been this close together? He remembered approving a reconfiguration to add 12 more seats per aircraft, but seeing it as a passenger rather than on a blueprint made it painfully real. Reaching row 23, John stored his carry-on and settled into his aisle seat. The middle seat was already occupied by a large man who had claimed both armrests. John said nothing, squeezing himself into the remaining space. He watched as other passengers struggled with the overhead bins, while the flight attendants seemed more focused on completing their pre-flight checks than helping. As the last passengers boarded, John overheard a flight attendant whisper to another, "Third full flight today and we're still short-staffed. I'm dead on my feet." The other nodded sympathetically. "That's what happens when management cuts corners. Did you see the memo about reducing our hotel allowance again?" John felt a twinge of guilt. He had signed off on that policy last month, seeing it only as a line item cost reduction, not as something that affected real people working long hours. The boarding door closed, and the safety demonstration began. John noticed how mechanically it was performed, nothing like the friendly, engaging style Sky Connect had once been known for. As the plane pushed back from the gate, he settled in for what was proving to be a very educational journey, and he hadn't even left the ground yet. As the plane climbed through the clouds, John watched the flight attendants begin their service. Routine. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, one of the workhorses of his fleet. He'd approved the interior design himself 4 years ago, choosing the blue and gray color scheme that now surrounded him. From his executive perspective, it had looked modern and professional. Sitting here now, he noticed how the once vibrant blues had faded to a dull shade, and scuff marks lined the lower walls of the cabin. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began to move about. A young mother across the aisle struggled to calm a fussy toddler, while simultaneously trying to retrieve a toy from the overhead bin. John expected a flight attendant to offer assistance. Helping passengers had always been part of Sky Connect's service philosophy, but none appeared. Eventually, an elderly passenger stood up and helped her reach the bag. "Thanks so much," the mother said gratefully. "My daughter dropped her teddy bear right before takeoff, and she can't sleep without it." "No problem, dear," the older man replied. "Can't expect much help from the crew these days on any airline. They're all too busy." John made a mental note of this exchange. Was this how passengers viewed his airline now? As a place where they couldn't expect help? The drink service began about 30 minutes into the flight. John observed the flight attendants closely as they worked their way down the aisle. Their movements were efficient but mechanical. When they reached his row, a flight attendant named Tom, according to his slightly crooked name tag, barely made eye contact. "Something to drink?" Tom asked, his knee suggesting this was the 100th time he'd said these words today. It probably was. "Just water, please," John replied, trying to engage. "Long day ahead in Boston?" "Just the turnaround and back to LA," Tom answered with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He quickly moved on to the next passenger. John sipped his water, noting how the plastic cup was thinner than it used to be, another cost-cutting measure he'd approved. The ice was already melting, leaving the drink watery. Small details, but they added up to the overall experience. The passenger in the middle seat beside John, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, sighed audibly as he tried to open his tray table while balancing his coffee. The table wobbled unsteadily. One of the hinges was loose. "Third flight this week and every plane has something broken," the man muttered, not particularly addressing John but clearly wanting his complaint to be heard. "You fly Sky Connect often?" John asked, seizing the opportunity. "Too often," the man replied, introducing himself as Bill. "My company signed a contract with them 3 years ago. Used to be a good airline. Not fancy, but reliable, and the staff seemed happy. Something changed the last couple years." John felt his chest tighten. "What kind of changes have you noticed?" Bill took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Everything's just less. Less legroom, less service, less maintenance from what I can see. Last month my flight had 3 broken reading lights in my row alone. The bathroom sink didn't work. When I mentioned it to the flight attendant, she just said, 'We've reported it multiple times.'" John nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Look at this." Bill gestured to the frayed edge of the seat pocket in front of him. "Small stuff, but it adds up. Makes you wonder if they're cutting corners on the important things too." The comment hit John like a punch to the gut. He'd never compromise on safety, ever, but he understood how these visible signs of wear could make passengers question everything. As their conversation continued, a passenger in the window seat, a woman in her 30s wearing wireless earbuds, removed one to join in. "I used to exclusively fly Sky Connect between Boston and LA because of the direct flight," she said. "But I'm considering switching to United, even though I'd have to connect. Their basic economy actually feels better than this now." "What's the main difference you've noticed?" John asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "The employees," she said without hesitation. "They used to seem like they enjoyed their jobs. Now they all look exhausted and unhappy." Bill nodded in agreement. "I got talking to a flight attendant on my red-eye last week. She told me they reduced their overnight rest periods and cut their per diem allowances. She was working a double shift because they're chronically understaffed." John felt a growing discomfort. He'd approved those changes too, seeing only the projected cost savings of $3.7 million annually. The human impact hadn't been discussed in the boardroom. "Did she mention anything else?" John asked, both dreading and needing to hear more. "Yeah, actually." Bill lowered his voice. "She said morale tanked after they slashed their health insurance benefits last year. Her daughter has asthma, and now her medications cost 3 times what they used to." That decision had been particularly contentious. John had ultimately sided with the CFO, who argued that the premium savings were necessary to remain competitive. It had saved the airline nearly $5 million annually, a win in the quarterly report. Sitting here now, listening to the real consequences, the victory felt hollow. The woman by the window leaned forward. "My brother-in-law works for maintenance at another airline. He says all the mechanics from Sky Connect are trying to jump ship because they're understaffed and overworked." John felt his face grow hot. Maintenance was sacred ground. He'd never allowed cuts there. "That can't be right," he said, perhaps too forcefully. Both passengers looked at him with surprise at his sudden intensity. "Sorry," he backpedaled. "I just mean, wouldn't that be a safety issue?" That's exactly what worries me, Bill said. My colleague said he overheard two Sky Connect pilots talking about management pushing for faster turnarounds. One of them said, "They just don't get what we're dealing with down here." The meal service began, interrupting their conversation. John stared at the packaged sandwich placed on his tray. It was smaller than he remembered from the sample he'd been shown when they changed catering companies. The bread was slightly dry at the edges. When he opened the packaged cookie, it was broken into pieces. Remember when they served actual hot meals in economy? Bill asked no one in particular. Now we get this, and they charge more for tickets than they did back then. The flight attendants moved quickly through the cabin, collecting trash almost immediately after serving. One passenger asked for a second drink and was told, "I'll try to come back if there's time." She never returned. John watched everything, with new eyes. He saw how the single lavatory for economy resulted in a constant line stretching down the aisle. He noticed the broken reading light above row 25, the sticky residue on the armrest that hadn't been properly cleaned, and the way the flight attendants gathered in the galley, speaking in hushed, tired voices during brief moments of downtime. When the pilot made an announcement about turbulence ahead, John realized something else. The captain hadn't introduced himself at the beginning of the flight, a small touch of personalization that had once been standard Sky Connect procedure. The seatbelt sign came on and the plane began to bounce through rough air. John heard a voice from behind him. "You know what kills me about these airlines?" A new voice from the row directly behind John. "The disconnect between the suits upstairs and what's happening on these planes." "Totally," replied another voice. "Bet the CEO never sits back here, in row 24 with his knees crushed against the seat in front of him." John froze, his water cup halfway to his lips. Were they talking about him specifically? "Did you see that article about the Sky Connect boss buying a vacation house in Vail while they were cutting employee health benefits?" The first voice continued. $14 million, the article said. John nearly choked. He had indeed purchased a vacation property last year, but it was in Aspen, not Vail, and it certainly hadn't cost $14 million. The public perception of his actions hit him with unexpected force. "That's how it always goes," the second voice replied. "The people at the top have no idea what life is like for their customers or their workers." The turbulence worsened, cutting off further conversation as the flight attendants hurried to secure the cabin. But the words had already done their damage. John sat motionless, his mind racing with everything he'd seen and heard in just the first 2 hours of his journey. For the first time, he was experiencing his own company not as its creator and leader, but as one of the people it served, or failed to serve. And the view from this side was far different than the one from his corner office 32 floors above the city. The plane continued to bounce through pockets of rough air, the fasten seatbelt sign remaining illuminated. John gripped his armrests. Not from fear of turbulence, he'd flown enough to be unbothered by it, but from the weight of what he was hearing from the passengers behind him. The conversation had shifted to comparing airlines, and Sky Connect wasn't faring well in their assessment. "My cousin flies for Northeast Airways," said the first voice, belonging to a man John couldn't see. "Says their staff morale is through the roof since the new CEO took over. Guy actually worked as a flight attendant for 10 years before climbing the corporate ladder." "Makes a difference when leadership understands the job," replied his companion. "Sky Connect used to be like that. Founder was a former pilot, wasn't he? But he retired, and now it's just another company run by finance people who only see spreadsheets, not people." John felt his face flush. He had started as an aviation business consultant, not a pilot, but he had always prided himself on understanding operations. Had he lost touch that badly? The turbulence subsided enough for the drink service to resume. Tom, the flight attendant, moved quickly through the cabin, his face showing signs of strain. When he reached John's row again, John noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Excuse me," John said as Tom handed him another water. "How many flights have you worked this week?" Tom seemed surprised by the personal question. He hesitated before answering. "This is my 5th today. We're on a 4-day trip with minimal rest periods." "That sounds exhausting," John said genuinely. Something in his tone must have resonated with Tom, whose professional veneer cracked slightly. It is. We're all running on empty. The company cut staffing levels last year, so we're doing the same. Work with fewer people. Has anyone from management addressed this? John asked. Tom gave a short, humorless laugh. Management doesn't fly in the back with the regular folks. They don't see what we deal with. He moved on quickly as more call buttons lit up down the aisle. Bill, still in the middle seat beside John, leaned over. My wife's a nurse. Same story there. Administrators who've never treated a patient making decisions that affect everyone. It's everywhere these days. John nodded, thinking about the last executive meeting where they discussed optimizing crew utilization, as if the flight attendants and pilots were just resources to be managed, not people with lives and limits. The conversation behind him resumed as the plane leveled off. I had to fly Sky Connect for a wedding last month, said a new voice, female this time. The flight was delayed 3 hours because they didn't have enough crew. The gate agent looked like she was about to cry when passengers started yelling at her. Not her fault, replied one of the men who had been speaking earlier. It's all these cutbacks. Did you know Sky Connect eliminated their reserve crew positions at smaller airports? My buddy's a pilot there. Says when someone calls in sick now, there's nobody to cover. John's stomach tightened. That particular decision had been presented to him as a more efficient use of human resources. The PowerPoint had shown the millions saved annually, but hadn't mentioned the domino effect of delays and cancellations, the stress on remaining staff, or the impact on passengers. You fly for work? The woman asked her seatmate. Yeah, consulting. Used to have status on Sky Connect until they changed their loyalty program last year. Now you need to spend a minimum amount in addition to miles flown. Basically, eliminated. Upgrades for everyone except the corporate accounts with deep pockets. Another of John's decisions. The revenue management team had projected a 12% increase in premium cabin revenue by making it harder for frequent flyers to use miles for upgrades, keeping those seats available for full-fare passengers. Had they considered how many loyal customers they might lose? John pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, jotting down everything he was hearing. The loyalty program changes, the crew scheduling issues, the maintenance concerns, the decline in service quality, the broken reading lights and tray tables, the toll on employee morale. Each item represented a decision he'd made or approved, each one defensible in isolation, financially sound on paper, but collectively, they had transformed his airline into something he barely recognized. An announcement crackled over the intercom. Flight attendants prepare for landing in approximately 30 minutes. John glanced at his watch, surprised so much time had passed. He'd been so engrossed in his observations and the conversations around him that the hours had flown by. As the plane began its initial descent, he noticed the woman across the aisle, struggling again, now trying to collect her toddler's toys while keeping the squirming child secured in her seat. Without thinking, John pressed his call button. When Tom arrived, looking harried, John gestured toward the mother. I think she could use some help. Tom glanced over, then nodded. Of course. He moved to assist her, helping gather the scattered toys and even producing a small packet of cookies for the child, who immediately stopped fussing. The mother mouthed a thank you to John, who smiled in return. It was such a small thing, but the woman's grateful expression highlighted what had been missing, the human connection that had once been at the core of Sky Connect's service philosophy. The core. Voices behind him continued their conversation, unaware of the airline's owner sitting directly in front of them. You know what's crazy? Said the female passenger. I tweeted about my delayed flight last month, and Sky Connect's social media team responded faster than their gate agents could help in person. It's all for show. Classic corporate move, her seatmate replied. Look good online while the actual experience falls apart. I bet their executives have meetings about their social media strategy, but never about fixing the real problems. John shifted uncomfortably, remembering the recent marketing presentation touting their improved social media response rates. The team had been proud of their 98% response rate within 10 minutes. But what good was responding quickly if the underlying issues weren't being addressed? As the plane descended through the clouds, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Professional but impersonal. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival. No mention of weather in Boston. No thank you for flying Sky Connect. None of the personal touches that cost nothing but meant something to passengers. Another detail lost. Another connection broken. The conversations around John quieted as passengers prepared for landing. He took the opportunity to reflect on everything he'd witnessed. It wasn't just one big problem, it was death by 1,000 cuts. Each cost-saving measure, each efficiency improvement, each policy change had seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation. But together, they had fundamentally changed the airline he had built. The plane touched down with a slight bump, right, on schedule despite the earlier turbulence. As they taxied to the gate, John heard one final exchange from the row behind him. "At least they're punctual," said the consultant who had lost his status. "For now," replied his companion. "My friend who's a gate agent says they've been cutting the scheduled maintenance time between flights. Sooner or later that catches up with you." John felt his blood run cold. That simply couldn't be true. He hadn't authorized any changes to the maintenance schedule. But then again, he hadn't authorized the hotel allowance cuts either. That had been delegated. What else was happening in his company without his direct knowledge? As the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin erupted into the usual chaos of deplaning. Passengers stood in the aisles, retrieving bags, checking phones, eager to exit. John remained seated, still processing everything he'd learned. Tom, the flight attendant, stood at the front of the cabin, delivering the standard farewell. "Thank you for flying with Sky Connect. Have a nice day." His words were correct, but his tone was flat, his eyes already focused on the tasks needed to prepare for the return flight. When most passengers had departed, John finally stood and collected his bag. As he made his way toward the exit, he noticed the flight attendants already rushing to clean the cabin, their movements hurried and stressed. 15-minute turnaround, he overheard one say to another. Barely enough time to do a security check, let alone clean properly. John stepped into the jetway, his mind whirling with all he had seen and heard. This wasn't the airline he had set out to build. Somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of profits and efficiency, Sky Connect had lost its soul, and he was responsible. As he walked through Boston Logan Airport, blending in with the crowd of arriving passengers, John knew that his journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The flight might be complete, but the real work lay ahead. The question was, could he transform what he'd learned into action before it was too late for the company he loved? John moved through Boston Logan Airport, with the flow of deplaning passengers, but his mind was a million miles away. Every sign, every announcement, every interaction now looked different to him. At a Sky Connect customer service desk, he paused to watch a harried agent deal with a line of frustrated travelers. The agent's name badge read Patricia, and her expression was a mask of professional politeness covering obvious exhaustion. "I'm sorry about your connecting flight," Patricia was saying to an elderly couple. "The system shows the delay is weather-related, so unfortunately we can't provide hotel accommodation." "But the sky is clear," the man protested, gesturing toward the windows, and the pilot announced it was a crew scheduling issue. Patricia's smile tightened. "I can only go by what's in the system, sir. I can offer you a $10 meal voucher." John winced. He knew exactly what was happening. The internal coding for delays had been modified last year, another cost-saving measure. Weather classification protected the airline from having to pay for hotels or provide significant compensation, while operational issues triggered passenger compensation requirements. The change had saved millions, but at what cost to honesty and customer goodwill? He continued on to baggage claim, where he had no bag to collect but wanted to observe this part of the Sky Connect experience too. The carousel was surrounded by waiting passengers, many checking watches or phones impatiently. 20 minutes passed before the first bags appeared. A Sky Connect ground crew member stood nearby, fielding questions from increasingly irritated travelers. John edged closer to listen. "I apologize for the delay," the young man was saying. "We're short-staffed today in baggage handling." "You're short-staffed every time I fly," replied a businesswoman in a sharp suit. "This is the third time this month my bags have taken forever to arrive." The crew member looked defeated. We're doing our best, ma'am. Management cut our team by 30% last quarter. Another knife twist in John's gut. The staffing reduction in ground operations had been presented to him as an optimization that wouldn't impact service. Clearly, that wasn't the case. John slipped away, headed for the exit. He'd planned to immediately book a return flight home, but now decided to stay overnight instead. He needed time to process everything he'd witnessed. Using his phone, he booked a room at an airport hotel, not the luxury accommodation he would normally choose, but a mid-range option that many of his business travelers might select. At the hotel, John checked in and went directly to his room. It was clean but basic, with a desk, king bed, and the standard amenities. He sat at the desk and pulled out his phone, opening a blank document. For the next hour, he typed furiously, documenting everything he'd seen, heard, and felt during his undercover journey. The list grew longer and longer. Maintenance concerns, crew fatigue, reduced cleaning time between flights, misleading delay codes, the declining quality of onboard service, the visible strain on employees, the broken fixtures that went unrepaired, the changed loyalty program that alienated frequent flyers, the thinner cups, the smaller meals, the eliminated amenities. Each item represented a decision that had seemed reasonable in the boardroom, a necessary adjustment to remain competitive in a challenging industry. But collectively, they told a different story. Sky Connect wasn't just becoming less pleasant, it was actively destroying what had once made it special. John pushed away from the desk and paced the small room. How had he let this happen? He'd started Sky Connect with a clear vision: to create an airline that treated passengers like valued guests and employees like family. Somewhere along the way, that vision had become obscured by quarterly targets and shareholder expectations. His phone rang, his real phone, not the prepaid one he'd purchased for this trip. It was Doug, his CFO. John hesitated but decided to answer. "John, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you all day. The board is asking about the new ancillary revenue proposal." "Which one is that?" John asked, though he knew perfectly well. "The one to reduce the free carry-on allowance to one item and charge for the second. Revenue projections show an additional $32 million annually." Just yesterday, John would have approved this without a second thought. Today, he could imagine the stressed passengers trying to stuff everything into one bag, the arguments with gate agents, the further erosion of the flying experience. "I need more time to consider it," John said. "More time?" "The implementation team is ready to go. Marketing has the announcement drafted. What's there to consider?" John took a deep breath. "The impact on our customers and our brand. I'll call you tomorrow." He ended the call before Doug could protest. Sitting on the edge of the bed, John turned on the TV to distract himself. Coincidentally, a local news program was doing a segment on air travel frustrations. "Airlines continue to add fees while reducing services," the reporter was saying. "Our viewer survey found that 78% of respondents believe the flying experience has deteriorated significantly over the past 5 years." The program cut to interviews with travelers. A mother traveling with children described the challenge of navigating airports with minimal assistance. A business traveler complained about the disappearance of customer service when things went wrong. An older man expressed concern about whether safety was being compromised. It wasn't just Sky Connect. The entire industry was trending in the same direction, but that didn't make it right. John switched off the TV and checked his watch. It was nearly 9 p.m., but he wasn't ready to sleep. On an impulse, he opened his laptop and logged into the Sky Connect internal system using his executive credentials. He navigated to the employee message boards, a platform he rarely visited despite encouraging its creation years ago, as a way for staff to share ideas and concerns. What he found shook him to his core. Thread after thread detailed deteriorating working conditions, increased pressure, and declining morale. Flight attendants described being asked to work while ill because there were no reserve crews. Pilots raised concerns about the reduced turnaround times between flights. Gate agents shared stories of being verbally abused by customers with no support from management. One post from a 10-year veteran flight attendant particularly stood out. "I used to be proud to wear this uniform. I used to tell everyone Sky Connect was different, that we cared about our passengers and each other. I don't feel that way anymore. It's just a job now, and not even a good one." The responses showed dozens of people agreeing. John closed his laptop, a heaviness settling in his chest. He'd been so focused on the numbers, on competitive positioning and market share, that he'd lost sight of the people who made Sky Connect what it was, both employees and customers. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The memory of a conversation from years ago surfaced, a talk with his mentor when he was first starting the airline. "Airlines aren't about planes," the older man had told him. "They're about people. The moment you forget that, you've lost your way." John had lost his way. Unable to sleep, he got up and returned to his notes, adding more observations and beginning to formulate a plan. By 3 a.m., bleary-eyed but determined, he had the outline of what needed to be done. It wouldn't be easy. Some of the changes would impact the bottom line, at least in the short term. The board wouldn't be happy. The shareholders might rebel. But if he didn't act now, there might not be a Sky Connect worth saving in the long run. As dawn broke over Boston, John showered and dressed, still maintaining his disguise. He had one more leg of his journey to complete, the return flight to Los Angeles. This time, he wouldn't just be observing. He'd be looking for specific details to support the changes he was planning to implement. At the airport, John positioned himself at a cafe with a clear view of the Sky Connect check-in counters. He watched the morning rush, noting how the understaffing created tension among both employees and customers. A supervisor moved between positions, trying to help but clearly overwhelmed. Passengers checked their watches impatiently. When it was time to head to his gate, John deliberately arrived early to observe the pre-boarding process. The gate area was crowded, with limited seating. Several people sat on the floor, including an elderly woman who struggled to get comfortable. The charging stations were fully occupied, with passengers hovering nearby, waiting for an opening. The gate agent announced a delay, 20 minutes, due to the late arrival of the incoming aircraft. John used his phone to check the flight tracking app. The incoming plane had actually arrived 30 minutes ago. This was another operations issue being disguised. When boarding finally began, John watched more carefully this time. He noticed how passengers with status boarded smoothly, while families with small children struggled. The gate agents, overwhelmed with the volume, had no time to offer assistance. Settling into his seat, an aisle seat again, but this time toward the front of economy, John focused on the interactions between crew members. They spoke in hushed tones, professional but clearly stressed. One mentioned having only 4 hours of sleep due to a schedule change. As the flight progressed, John engaged with the flight attendants more deliberately, asking questions that might provide insight without revealing his identity. "Been with Sky Connect long?" he asked one who served him a drink. 7 years, she replied, though sometimes it feels like 70. "Still enjoy it?" She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I used to love it. The job's changed a lot." "How so?" "Less time with passengers, more pressure to sell. They track how many premium drinks and snack boxes we sell now. There are quotas." She straightened, up as a supervisor passed by. "Anyway, anything else I can get you?" John shook his head, making another mental note. Sales quotas for flight attendants had been implemented last year, another revenue enhancement strategy that looked good on paper but transformed caring service professionals into reluctant salespeople. Throughout the flight, John observed and listened. He heard passengers comparing Sky Connect unfavorably to competitors. He saw flight attendants going through the motions without the enthusiasm that had once been a hallmark of the airline. He noticed the same signs of wear and neglect he'd seen on the outbound flight: frayed seat covers, spotty Wi-Fi, broken reading lights. By the time the plane landed in Los Angeles, John had filled several more pages of notes on his phone. More importantly, he had clarity. The airline he'd built was at a crossroads, and the decisions he made in the coming days would determine whether Sky Connect returned to its founding principles or continued down the path of decline. As passengers stood to deplane, John remained seated, watching the controlled chaos of arrival. A flight attendant noticed him still sitting there. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked. "Just thinking," John replied. "Do you ever wonder if the people running this airline have any idea what it's really like to fly it?" The flight attendant gave a small, sad smile. "Every single day." John nodded. Maybe that's about to change. The Monday morning executive meeting at Sky Connect headquarters had a different energy than usual. The leadership team assembled in the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor, exchanging puzzled glances. John Reynolds, normally punctual to a fault, was 10 minutes late, unprecedented in the company's history. When he finally walked in, several executives did double takes. John's normally clean-shaven appearance had been replaced with a full beard. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but there was an intensity in his expression that commanded attention. "Good morning," John said, remaining standing, rather than taking his usual seat at the head of the table. "I apologize for the delay. I've been on a journey that's taken longer than expected." Doug, the CFO, glanced at his watch with poorly concealed impatience. "We have the ancillary revenue proposal to finalize today. The board is expecting—" "The board will have to wait," John interrupted, something he rarely did. "We have more important matters to discuss." The room fell silent. The 6 people at the table, the chief officers of finance, operations, marketing, technology, human resources, and customer experience, exchanged concerned looks. "For the past 5 days," John continued, "I've been flying on our airline as a regular passenger. No special treatment, no executive privileges, no one knowing who I was. I flew in economy. I experienced delays. I used our customer service channels. I listened to our passengers and fed our staff." The silence in the room deepened. The COO, Peter, leaned forward with visible concern. "John, if there was an issue, you could have just asked for a report." "Reports don't tell the whole story," John replied. "Reports don't show you the resigned look in a flight attendant's eyes when they're too exhausted to care. Reports don't capture the frustration of passengers trying to fit their belongings into ever-shrinking spaces. Reports don't let you feel what it's like when the plane is delayed and no one tells you why." He placed a thick folder on the table. "This is what I experienced. This is what our customers experience every day. And it's not what Sky Connect was meant to be." For the next 45 minutes, John detailed everything he'd observed. The maintenance concerns, the crew fatigue, the misleading delay codes, the declining service quality, the visible strain on employees, the broken fixtures that went unrepaired. He shared conversations he'd overheard, interactions he'd witnessed, problems he'd experienced firsthand. As he spoke, the executives' reactions varied. Doug, the CFO, repeatedly shook his head, clearly calculating the cost implications of what John was suggesting. Peter, the COO, looked increasingly uncomfortable, especially when John mentioned the reduced maintenance turnaround times, a change implemented at the operations level that had never been brought to John's attention. The chief marketing officer took notes rapidly, perhaps already thinking about damage control. "What exactly are you proposing?" Doug finally asked, when John paused. "These operational issues can be addressed, but if you're suggesting we roll back our efficiency measures, the financial impact would be significant. The shareholders—" "I'm proposing we remember why we started this airline," John interrupted. "We didn't create Sky Connect just to have the best numbers in the industry. We created it to be the best airline, for our passengers and our people." He turned to the whiteboard and began writing. "I'm announcing a new initiative effective immediately. We're calling it Reconnect with Sky Connect. It has 3 main components." John wrote as he spoke. "First, service restoration. We're reinstating our original seat pitch in economy by removing 2 rows of seats from each aircraft. Yes, that's 24 fewer seats per plane we can sell, but it's thousands of passengers who will have a more comfortable experience. Doug started to protest, but John continued. Second, employee renewal. We're reversing the cuts to health benefits, reinstating proper rest periods, and adding back the reserve crews we eliminated. We're also implementing a bottom-up review of working conditions, led by frontline staff, not executives. The Chief Human Resources Officer looked both surprised and relieved. She'd argued against many of these cuts when they were proposed. Third, leadership accountability. John underlined this point heavily. Every executive in this room, including me, will fly our airline in economy class at least once per quarter. Not on special flights, not with advance warning to the crew, regular flights experiencing exactly what our customers experience. Additionally, each of us will spend 1 day per quarter working alongside our frontline staff, checking in passengers, handling baggage, serving drinks, whatever is needed. The room erupted in protests. That's not practical. We don't have the training, the liability issues alone. John held up his hand. This isn't a suggestion. It's a new condition of employment for leadership at SkyConnect. If we're not willing to experience our own product as our customers do, we have no business making decisions about it. He handed each executive a document. Here's the full plan, including timeline and budget implications. Yes, Doug, it will impact our bottom line in the short term. The service restoration component alone will cost approximately $42 million annually in lost revenue potential. The CFO looked like he might faint, but, John continued, I believe these changes will pay off dramatically in the long run. Our customer satisfaction has been in free fall for 2 years. Our employee turnover is at an all-time high. We're spending millions on recruitment and training that we wouldn't need to spend if people wanted to stay. Most importantly, we're losing what made SkyConnect special. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. We have a choice to make. We can continue down the path we're on, squeezing every dollar out of every flight until there's nothing left of the airline we built. Or we can remember that aviation is ultimately about people, the ones who fly with us and the ones who make that possible. The Chief Customer Experience Officer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. I support this. I've been trying to raise the alarm about our declining passenger satisfaction for months. I know, John acknowledged. I should have listened sooner. The meeting continued for 3 more hours, working through the details of the plan. There were arguments and concerns, particularly from finance. But by the end, a path forward had emerged. The initiative would begin immediately, with the first changes visible to customers within 30 days. 2 weeks later, John stood at the podium in the company's largest hangar, addressing hundreds of SkyConnect employees. The setting was deliberate, not the corporate headquarters where executives typically made announcements, but a working facility where aircraft were maintained and prepared for flight. Behind him stood the executive team, each wearing standard SkyConnect uniforms rather than business attire. Another deliberate choice to emphasize the message of the day. For 15 years, John began, I've had the privilege of leading this airline. We started small, with big dreams and clear values. Somewhere along the way, as we grew, some of those values got lost. Today, we're finding them again. He outlined the Reconnect initiative, explaining each component and the reasoning behind it. As he spoke, he could see the reactions rippling through the crowd. Surprise, skepticism, cautious hope. These changes won't happen overnight, John acknowledged. Some will take months to fully implement. But starting today, SkyConnect is recommitting to what made us special, putting people first, both the ones who choose to fly with us and the ones who make that possible. He gestured to the executives behind him. Leadership begins with listening and understanding. That's why, starting next week, every member of our executive team will be working alongside you, checking in passengers, serving drinks, loading baggage, answering customer calls, not as a publicity stunt but as a regular part of our jobs. Going forward, a murmur ran through the crowd. We won't always get things right, John continued, but we're going to start by admitting where we've gone wrong. The changes to health benefits, crew rest periods, staffing levels, those decisions looked good on paper but ignored the human cost. We're reversing them, effective immediately. A spontaneous burst of applause interrupted him. John waited for it to subside before continuing. Some of you may be wondering why the sudden change. What happened to make us see things differently? He paused. The truth is, I stopped looking at spreadsheets and started looking at people. I flew on our airline as a regular passenger sitting in economy, experiencing what our customers experience. What I saw and heard changed my perspective completely. Over the next 6 months, the Reconnect initiative gradually transformed SkyConnect. The changes weren't without challenges. The board initially pushed back on the anticipated impact to quarterly earnings. Some shareholders sold their stock when the plan was announced. Analysts questioned whether the airline could remain competitive while rejecting industry trends toward greater density and reduced service. But something unexpected happened as the changes took hold. Employee turnover dropped dramatically within the first quarter. Crew members who had been job hunting chose to stay. Applications for open positions increased. The cost of recruitment and training declined sharply. Customer metrics began to improve by the end of the second quarter. On-time performance, once suffering due to understaffing and unrealistic turnaround times, rebounded to industry-leading levels. Customer satisfaction scores, which had been in decline for years, reversed course. Most surprisingly to the skeptics, bookings increased. Load factors remained strong despite the reduced seat count. The airline found that passengers were willing to pay slightly more for a noticeably better experience. 8 months after his undercover journey, John sat in economy on a flight from Chicago to Seattle. This wasn't one of his required quarterly trips. Those were documented and tracked to ensure compliance from all executives. This was simply how he chose to travel now, understanding that he couldn't lead what he didn't experience regularly. As the boarding process completed, he noticed how different it felt from his first undercover flight. The crew seemed energized, not exhausted. They assisted passengers proactively. The cabin, while still a commercial aircraft with inherent limitations, felt less cramped. The small details, clean seat pockets, working fixtures, responsive service, added up to a fundamentally different experience. Midway through the flight, John overheard a conversation from the row behind him. "First time flying SkyConnect?" one passenger asked another. "No, but it's been a while. They seem different somehow." "They are. Read an article about them last month. New approach, focusing on employee and customer experience instead of just cramming in more seats. Apparently their CEO went undercover on his own airline and didn't like what he saw." "Huh. Wish more companies would do that." John smiled to himself, but said nothing. The true success of the Reconnect initiative wasn't measured in quarterly reports or industry accolades, though those had begun to come. It was measured in conversations like this one, in passengers noticing the difference, in employees taking pride in their work again, in an airline remembering its purpose. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the captain's voice came over the intercom, warm, personable, engaged. He thanked everyone for choosing SkyConnect, mentioned the local weather, and added a personal touch about a good restaurant near the airport. It was a small thing, that personal connection. It cost nothing, yet somehow it was everything. The airline was reconnecting one flight at a time,